Hello everyone, this is Kingrats here. Welcome back to the channel, guys. Back with another episode for the Swap Streak series. This time returning to the NHL, but bringing in a little bit more of a retro trade history. So for all the old ones out there, perhaps this video will resonate more with you than my others, but we'll have to see. So this video mainly covers one NHL player in particular who got traded a grand total of 7 times, which is literally just 2 trades away from the all-time record of 9 in a playing career. And this player has gone through a number of NHL teams. He had a very lengthy career considering where he was when he started. And he ultimately did contribute to a certain degree to the history of the NHL and how certain teams would later become champions as the years went by. So, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Tom Kurvers swap streak. Now, if you're not familiar with Tom Kurvers, he was a NHL defenseman who was drafted in the 1981 entry draft in the 7th round by the Montreal Canadiens. His career numbers necessarily weren't that big. He was more of a defenseman that can be very offensively minded, but also had a lot of grit and toughness to his game. He spent 4 years in the University of Minnesota Duluth throughout the 1980s and didn't make it to the NHL until 1984 with the Montreal Canadiens. His rookie season was very good, 45 points, 75 games played. He also played in 12 playoff games for Montreal that year. In 85-86, he had a down season, but he did win the Stanley Cup with Montreal, and that was really the only piece of hardware he ever picked up in his career. In 86-87, though, things started taking a turn. He only played 1 game for Montreal, and his trade history essentially began in the middle of the 86-87 season. His point totals are actually not too bad from where he was drafted in hindsight. His totals for the regular season are 659 total games played, 93 goals, 328 assists, and a grand total of 421 points, along with 352 penalty minutes. And for the time that he did get to spend in the playoffs, he actually picked up 30 points in 38 total playoff games. For Kurvers, his career was quite lengthy at the NHL level, and he kind of fit the mold of that old school defenseman at the time, and that really helped him to stand out in the league. But after a few years in Montreal, his trade history ultimately begins with him getting sent to the Buffalo Sabres straight up for a second-round pick in 1988. The second rounder turned into Martin Saint-Amour, who ultimately was a bust for Montreal. He never played in the league. For Kurvers, he would spend a little bit of time in Buffalo. His point totals would continue to be relatively consistent. He only spent 1 year, however, with the Sabres, playing in just 55 games in the 86-87 season. And in the following season, he was traded again, this time to the New Jersey Devils, in exchange for a 3rd-round pick in 1987 and a 10th-round pick in 1989. The 3rd-rounder turned into Andrew McVicker, who ultimately did not amount to anything at the NHL level and essentially didn't make the big leagues whatsoever. However, Mark Astley was drafted with the 10th round pick, and surprisingly enough, he did make it to the NHL. I think he played in about 90 NHL games across the span of a couple of seasons with the Sabres. However, he spent most of his career in the minor leagues, and in particular, he spent most of his career in Europe playing in the NLA in the 90s and 2000s after his time in the NHL was essentially done. But Astley never got traded as a player in the NHL level, so essentially that ends the line there. For Kurvers, he would have sort of a renaissance when it comes to his scoring production. Going to New Jersey, he played in just 56 games in the 87-88 season, recording 34 points, and then in 88-89, he exploded for 66 points, 50 assists season that year. However, he did not play in the playoffs. He would spend a little bit of time with the Devils, but after his career year there in 1989, he was then flipped to the Toronto Maple Leafs for a 1st-round pick in 1991, which ultimately turned into Scott Niedermayer. The Leafs were looking for a gritty defenseman that could really help them rebuild in a certain way. This was also towards the end of the Harold Ballard era for the Maple Leafs, and the whole organization just had a dramatic pivot at the end of the 1980s going into the 90s. For Kurvers, he would spend about 2 seasons in Toronto. His production sort of carried over from New Jersey to Toronto, putting up 52 52 points in 70 games, but that first round pick in 1991 ultimately went third overall because the Leafs organization basically took a turn for the worst and completely plummeted down the standings. And it was an unprotected pick, and that's why the Devils were able to use it to select Scott Niedermayer. Niedermayer himself never got traded in his career. He was ultimately a Hall of Famer. He would help the Devils win 3 Stanley Cups across the 90s and early 2000s, and basically would stick around with the organization for basically the next 15 or so years before ultimately he left as a free agent to the Anaheim Ducks at the time of the NHL lockout in 2005. For Kurvers, as I mentioned, with the terrible down season he had in 1990-91 with the Leafs, which led to the Niedermayer pick going to New Jersey, he was ultimately traded again, and this time Kurvers was flipped to the Vancouver Canucks straight up for Brian Bradley. Bradley never got traded from Toronto after this trade, so essentially this ends the line there. For Kurvers, he also didn't spend much time in Vancouver. He only played in 32 games in the 1990-91 season over there before he was later flipped again, this time to the Minnesota North Stars for Dave Babych. Babych was a seasoned NHLer at this point in time, and he would actually stick around in Vancouver for a good period. He was a pretty solid NHLer and would stick around with the Canucks for most of the 1990s. He would be part of the 1994 Cinderella squad that made it to the Stanley Cup final, only to lose to the New York Rangers. And for Babych, he would spend some time in Vancouver in the late 90s before he was ultimately traded again, this time to the Philadelphia Flyers in 1998, along with a 5th round pick in that year's draft in exchange for a 3rd round pick in 1998 going back to Vancouver. The 5th round pick that went to Philadelphia turned into Garrett Brosovsky, a guy who never made it to the NHL. He mostly played in the CHL and in some lower leagues in Europe, most notably Germany. And the 3rd round pick that went to Vancouver turned into Justin Morrison, who you could say maybe was probably a better selection initially. Morrison did play in about 5 NHL seasons in the NHL, mostly with the Vancouver Canucks and 1 year actually in Atlanta. He didn't really amount to much at the NHL level, but he did make a little bit of history coming from Colorado College. He was the 2nd highest pick in the school's history of the NHL draft, and he also became the first African American from the LA area to be drafted into the NHL. So I guess he has that to say. For Babych, he didn't spend much time in Philly after this trade, as he was later flipped again in 1999 to the LA Kings, along with a 5th round pick in the year 2000 for Steve Duchesne. For Duchesne, this was a full circle moment, considering he was with the Flyers about a decade earlier and was part of the Eric Lindros trade that saw Lindros go to Philadelphia from the Quebec Nordiques. So for Duchesne, this was a full circle moment. He never got traded again. For the Kings, they would hang on to Babych, but he ultimately left them as a free agent. The 5th round pick in 2000 turned into Nathan Marsters, who was a goalie prospect, never made it to the NHL, and mostly stuck around in the ECHL and never got traded from the Kings. Going back to Kurvers, after he went to the North Stars, he actually was then rerouted in a separate trade going to the New York Islanders for Craig Ludwig. I really couldn't find much information about Ludwig other than the fact that he never got traded again after this, so don't worry about it. For Kurvers, he would then spend the next couple seasons in Long Island helping out the Islanders over there and was part of some okay teams. He did get into the playoffs again in 92-93 with Long Island playing in 12 games over there, but his production would steadily decline, so great in fact that he actually played in the AHL for about 7 games for the Islanders affiliate there. In 93-94, he would play 66 games before he was traded one last time, this time to the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim. Of course, it says Anaheim Ducks, but they were then called the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim for Troy Loney. For Loney, he never got traded again in his career, so don't worry about it. And for Kurvers, he didn't spend much time for the Ducks. He only played in 22 games in 94-95 and ultimately left as a free agent for Japan, where he played in the Japan Ice Hockey League for Seibu. He had 18 goals and 34 assists for 52 points, but it's not sure as to how many games he actually played. And that pretty much ends Tom Kurvers' trade history. It's a very short trade history, but considering he was traded multiple times and at least one of these trades turned into a historical player at the NHL level and ultimately led to multiple Stanley Cups, we can very well argue that Kurvers was a valuable player to NHL's history. Not to mention he did win a Stanley Cup with Montreal in 1986, so he does get to hang that on his head. Unfortunately, I think he passed away from lung cancer a couple of years ago. It's unfortunate, and he died very young, but his history in the NHL will live on forever. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this type of stuff, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and don't forget to hit the notification bell when you subscribe. And I will see you all in my next video.